Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a big one, deep learning. We've got a stack of material here, really technical stuff, and our goal is to synthesize it, make it clear, make it digestible.
Exactly. We want to cut through the jargon.
Yeah.
Deep learning, or DL, it's everywhere, but it can feel, well, impenetrable. So we're going to lay out a roadmap for you.
Think of it as translating the acronyms, breaking down the models, really understanding how these deep neural networks work under the hood.
So terms like CNN, TNN, backpropagation,
Yeah.
they'll hopefully move from being just buzzwords to actual concepts you grasp.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. First off, duck learning. People sometimes talk about it like it's this totally separate thing from machine learning. Our sources say that's not quite right, is it?
No, not at all. It's important to get this clear from the start. Deep learning isn't some extra kind of ML. It's actually a very powerful sub-branch of the artificial neural networks family, ANNs.
So it's within the ANN umbrella, and the deep
Exactly.
opti, that comes from the structure.
Precisely. The core definition is right there. DL uses multiple internal hidden layers. That's the deep bit. And having these multiple layers allows the system to build up more levels of abstraction, more complex internal representations.
Abstraction. What does that look like in practice? Why are those extra layers so beneficial?
It creates a hierarchy of understanding. Think about, say, image recognition. The first hidden layer might just learn to spot basic things, like simple lines or edges in the image data.
Okay, basic features.
Right. Then the next layer takes those edges and learns to combine them. It might start recognizing more complex shapes, like circles or squares, built from those simpler lines.
Ah, I see. Building blocks.
Exactly. Layer by layer, it builds a more sophisticated model. By the time the information reaches the final output layer, the network isn't just seeing pixels. It has constructed this robust internal concept, allowing it to make a reliable decision, like identifying a specific person's face.
That makes a lot more sense. It's building complexity internally. And, it feels so modern, but the basic idea of these networks, these simulated neurons, that goes way back, doesn't it?
It really does. The actual computational model, neurons summing inputs, producing an output that was established by McCulloch and Pitts way back in 1943. That's really the historical starting point for ANNs.
Almost 80 years ago. Amazing.
Now let's get to the heart of what makes modern DL different from traditional machine learning. There are two really fundamental distinctions. These are key for those aha moments.
Okay, lay out the first one for us.
The first big difference is how they handle data volume. DL systems, they fundamentally thrive on massive data sets. Their performance keeps improving the more data you feed them.
More data, better results. Seems intuitive.
You'd think so, but traditional ML methods often hit a plateau. Sometimes, paradoxically, their predictions can even get worse if you flood them with too much data, especially highly variable data. They just can't handle the complexity.
Wait, so the sheer number of parameters in a deep network gives it the capacity to actually use all that complex data, whereas a simpler model just gets overwhelmed.
That's a great way to put it, yes. They are engineered to absorb and leverage that complexity. And the second distinction, even more crucial, I think, for anyone who's actually worked with ML.
Which is?
Automatic feature extraction. Remember, in traditional ML, all that time spent on feature engineering, manually figuring out what characteristics of the data mattered, the size, the color, the texture, whatever it was for your problem.
Oh, yeah. Hours and hours of trying to guess what the model needed.
Exactly. DL systems, they largely automate that. The network looks at the raw input pixels, audio waves, text, and it learns the important features itself directly from the data as part of the training process.
So it's doing the hard, bespoke feature work internally. That's a huge advantage. And these systems, they can learn in different ways, right? Supervised, unsupervised.
Correct. DL can be supervised using labeled data, unsupervised with unlabeled data, or even use hybrid approaches combining both.
Okay, let's get into the architectures, the building blocks. What's the simplest starting point?
That would be the Multilayer Perceptron, the MLP. It's really the foundational DL algorithm.
Describe the MLP for us.
It's a fully connected feed-forward network. That means information flows in one direction. From the input layer, at least one hidden layer, usually more in DL, to the output layer. Every node connects to every node in the next layer.
Fully connected and feed forward. Got it.
And here's a key technical point. Except for the input nodes, every other node uses a nonlinear activation function. This is absolutely critical.
Why nonlinear?
Because if you only use linear functions, stacking layers wouldn't actually add any power. A bunch of linear functions combined is still just a linear function. The nonlinearity is what allows the network to learn complex patterns, curves, and boundaries in the data that aren't just straight lines.
Makes sense. And how does it learn?
It typically uses a supervised learning technique called backpropagation. We'll touch on that more later, but it's the mechanism for adjusting the connections based on errors. And because of those nonlinear activations, MLPs can handle data that isn't linearly separable, problems that simple models can't solve.
That's a big step up. And for listeners using Python, you mentioned Sklearn.
Right. If you're using the standard scikit-learn library, the MLP classifier regressor, based on this backpropagation approach, is actually the only deep neural network implementation you'll find natively in there.
Good to know. But before we got to modern MLPs and CNNs, there was an important historical step, wasn't there? The neocognitron.
Ah, yes, the neocognitron, proposed back in 1979 by Fukushima. Hugely influential. It directly inspired the convolutional neural networks, the CNNs, that dominate computer vision today.
And it was modeled on biology?
Yes, specifically on the Hubble and Wiesel model of the mammalian visual cortex. It had this structure of alternating layers with two different types of cells.
Tell us about those cells. What did they do?
There were S cells for simple cells. These acted like feature extractors. They performed what we now call convolutions, basically scanning for local patterns like edges or lines.
Okay, finding the basic features.
And then there were C cells for complex cells. Their job was to provide some robustness, managing things like small shifts or distortions in the feature's position. So if an edge moved slightly, a C cell could still recognize it.
So it had feature extraction and some built-in tolerance for variation. You can see the seeds of modern CNNs there.
Absolutely. That hierarchical structure, S cells feeding C cells layer after layer, it was a very early functional example of deep learning principles.
All right, here's where it gets really interesting, as you said. Let's talk about the modern workhorses, starting with convolutional neural networks, CNNs.
Right, CNNs. These are kings in the world of spatial data, primarily images, so 2D data, but they're also very effective for 1D signals like audio or even 3D data like medical scans.
And how do they relate to the MLP we just discussed?
You can think of a CNN as a cleverly regularized MLP. A standard deep MLP applied to images would have an insane number of connections and parameters, leading to massive overfitting. It would just memorize the training images.
Too many connections, too much memorization.
Exactly. CNNs solve this. They exploit the inherent structure in spatial data, the fact that nearby pixels are related using much smaller shared filters or kernels. This drastically reduces the parameters.
And the core operation is that convolution you mentioned with the neocognitron.
Yes. The convolution involves sliding a small filter or kernel across the input image. At each position, you compute the dot product between the filter's values and the image pixel values underneath it. This process detects specific features, edges, corners, textures, wherever they appear in the image.
Okay, so convolutions find the features, but CNNs use other tricks too, right? Like pooling.
Absolutely. Pooling layers like max pooling 2D are crucial. They downsample the feature maps produced by the convolutional layers. They reduce the spatial dimensions, making the representation smaller, and this helps control overfitting.
How does reducing the size help?
Well, it makes the network less sensitive to the exact location of features. This property is called translation invariance. Whether a cat is in the top left or bottom right of the image, after pooling, the network can still recognize the essential catness features. It's not just about shrinking things. It provides robustness.
I see. It generalizes better. And what about other regularization methods specific to CNNs?
Two key ones are parameter sharing. Sharing this is intrinsic to convolution, actually. The same filter, the same set of weights, is used across the entire image to detect a feature. This massively cuts down parameters compared to an MLP where every connection has its own weight.
One filter used everywhere.
Right. And another technique is drop block. Unlike regular dropout, which drops individual neurons, drop block removes entire contiguous regions of a feature map during training. This forces the network to learn more robust features, preventing it from relying too heavily on just one specific local pattern.
Clever. Forcing it to look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And we can see these ideas evolving through famous architectures. Early ones like Linnet 5 in the 90s, great for handwritten digits.
A classic.
Then huge leaps later, things like GoogleNet. This introduced the inception module. The core idea there was to make the network wider, not just deeper.
Wider? How?
Instead of picking just one filter size for a layer, the inception module runs multiple convolutions with different filter sizes, like 1x1, 3x3, 5x5, in parallel on the same input, and then concatenates their outputs.
Why do you do that?
It allows the network to capture features at multiple scales simultaneously within the same layer. A small filter picks up fine details. A larger one sees broader patterns, is more efficient, and helps combat overfitting.
And GoogleNet also did something clever at the end, right? With the final layers.
Yes, instead of ending with large, fully connected layers, which have tons of parameters, it used global average pooling. It just averages each final feature map down to a single number. This dramatically reduced the parameter count right before the final classification, practically down to 0 in that part. Very efficient.
Yeah, smart. But as networks got even deeper, another problem emerged. Degradation.
Right, the degradation problem. Counterintuitively, just stacking more and more layers sometimes made the network worse at training, not better. It wasn't just overfitting, the network struggled to learn. Information seemed to get lost or garbled in the deep stack.
So how did they fix that?
With residual connections, or skip connections. This was the key innovation in architectures like ResNet, and later combined into things like Inception ResNet.
Skip connections, what do they do?
They create shortcuts in the network. A skip connection allows the output of an earlier layer to be added directly to the input of a much later layer, essentially bypassing several layers in between.
How does that help?
It makes it much easier for the gradient signal during backpropagation to flow back through the network, even very deep ones. It ensures that the network can easily learn an identity mapping, meaning if an intermediate block of layers isn't helpful, the network can just learn to ignore it by passing the input straight through the skip connection.
So it prevents information loss and makes training much deeper networks feasible. That was a huge breakthrough.
Absolutely massive. It fundamentally changed how deep networks could be built. Okay, so that's CNNs for spatial data. Now let's pivot to sequences, data where order matters, and inputs might not be independent or even the same length. Think text, speech, time series.
Right. This is where recurrent neural networks, RNNs, come in.
Exactly. RNNs were designed for sequential data. The key idea is that they have a hidden state, an internal memory that gets updated each step in the sequence, carrying information from previous steps forward.
So they have a kind of memory of what came before. Useful for context.
Very useful. Think about understanding a sentence. The meaning of a word often depends on the words that came before it. RNNs could capture that short-term context. They were used for things like unsegmented speech recognition.
But they had limitations, didn't they? Especially with longer sequences.
Big time. The famous vanishing gradient problem hit RNNs hard. They struggled to learn dependencies between elements that were far apart in the sequence. They'd effectively forget the beginning of a long sentence by the time they reached the end.
The memory wasn't long enough.
Precisely, which led to more sophisticated variants. LSTMs, long short-term memory networks, and GRUs, gated recurrent units.
How did LSTMs improve things?
LSTMs introduced the concept of gates. These are little neural network components within the LSTM cell that learn to control the flow of information. There's an input gate controlling new information, an output gate controlling what gets passed on, and crucially, a forget gate.
A forget gate. It learns what to forget.
Exactly. The forget gate learns, based on the current input and the previous state, which pieces of information in the memory are no longer relevant and should be discarded. This allows LSTMs to maintain important context over thousands of time steps, overcoming the short-term memory limitation of basic RNNs. GRUs are similar, just a slightly simpler gated architecture.
That's fascinating. Learning to forget is key to remembering long-term. But even LSTMs have been somewhat superseded recently, haven't they, by transformers?
Yes, the Transformer Neural Network, TNN architecture, introduced in the paper Attention is All You Need, really revolutionized sequence modeling, particularly in natural language processing. Think models like BERT, GPT, they're built on transformers.
And what's the big difference? They're not recurrent.
Correct. That's a key distinction. Transformers are non-recurrent. They don't process the input sequence step by step like RNNs or LSTMs. Instead, they process the entire input sequence simultaneously.
How does that work, and why is it better?
It allows for massive parallelization during training. You can process all words in a sentence at the same time, which is much faster on modern hardware like GPUs and TPUs. But the real magic enabling this is the attention mechanism.
Attention, we hear that word a lot. What is it doing?
Specifically, multi-head self-attention. Instead of relying on a hidden state passed sequentially, the attention mechanism allows every element, say every word, in the input sequence to directly look at and draw information from every other element in the sequence.
So any word can attend to any other word, no matter how far apart.
Precisely. The network learns, for each word, which other words in the sequence are most relevant for understanding its context. It calculates attention scores between all pairs of words. This allows it to capture long-range dependencies much more effectively than RNNs ever could. It can connect a pronoun near the end of a paragraph back to the noun it refers to way back at the beginning.
That ability to see the whole context at once, that's the breakthrough.
That's the core of why models like GPT are so powerful at understanding and generating coherent text. It's that global contextual view provided by attention.
Amazing stuff. Okay, shifting gears slightly. Let's talk about models that don't just classify or predict, but actually create data. Generative models.
Right. Two main types to cover here: autoencoders, AEs, and generative adversarial networks, GANs.
Let's start with autoencoders. What's their main purpose?
Autoencoders are primarily used for unsupervised learning, specifically for learning efficient representations or codings of data, often unlabeled data. They work in two parts.
Encoding and decoding.
Exactly. There's an encoder part that takes the input data and compresses it down into a smaller, dense representation called the latent space or code. And then there's a decoder part that tries to reconstruct the original input data solely from that compressed latent representation.
What's the point of compressing and then reconstructing?
The network is forced to learn the most important salient features of the data to be able to compress it effectively and then reconstruct it accurately. It's learning a compact representation. This is useful for dimensionality reduction, feature learning, and also things like denoising autoencoders, where you train it to reconstruct a clean image from a noisy input image.
Okay, so they learn compact representations. Now, GNs, these get a lot of hype.
They do, and for good reason. GenANs, generative adversarial networks, are a really clever framework. They involve two neural networks locked in a competition.
Two networks. What do they do?
You have a generator, G network. Its job is to create synthetic data, fake images, fake text, whatever that looks as realistic as possible.
Okay, the artist or forger.
Kinda, yeah. And then you have a discriminator, D network. Its job is to look at both real data from the actual data set and the fake data produced by the generator and try to tell them apart. It tries to identify the fakes.
The detective or art critic.
Exactly. And they train together. The generator gets better at fooling the discriminator, and the discriminator gets better at spotting the fakes. They push each other to improve in this adversarial game.
And the result?
The result, ideally, is a generator that becomes incredibly good at producing highly realistic synthetic data. GNs are famous for creating photorealistic images, deepfake videos, but also used for generating synthetic training data, which can be really valuable when real data is scarce or private.
Fascinating. So regardless of whether it's a CNN, TNN, AE, or GN, the underlying learning process, it shares common elements, right?
Absolutely. The core mechanics are generally the same. Training is all about minimizing error. The network makes a prediction. You compare it to the actual target value using a loss function. This calculates how wrong the prediction was.
The loss tells you the error.
Right. And that error signal is then used by the backpropagation algorithm. This is fundamental. Backpropagation calculates how much each connection weight in the entire network contributed to that final error.
Working backwards from the error.
Precisely. It propagates the error signal backward through the layers. Then, using that information, an optimizer algorithm like stochastic gradient descent, SGD, or more advanced ones like ADAM, makes small adjustments to the weights of those connections to reduce the error next time.
So it's this cycle. Predict, calculate loss, backpropagate error, adjust weights. Repeat millions of times.
That's the essence of how most deep networks learn. It's iterative optimization guided by the loss signal.
Okay, now this all sounds incredibly powerful, but it's not magic. For someone actually trying to implement this raises an important question. What are the big practical hurdles, the real-world challenges?
Good question. There are several, but let's focus on three major ones that our sources highlight. First, the high data requirement.
We touched on this. They need a lot of data.
An enormous amount. Because these models have millions, sometimes billions of parameters, they need vast data sets to learn effectively and, crucially, to generalize, to perform well on new, unseen data. There's a rough rule of thumb, though it's very approximate, suggesting you might need something on the order of p-squared observations, where p is the number of parameters, to even start getting good generalization.
P-squared. If p is millions, that's astronomical amounts of data.
It really is. Data acquisition and labeling can be a massive bottleneck.
Yeah.
The second hurdle is related. The lack of interpretability, often called the black box problem.
Right. The network gives an answer, but we don't know why.
Exactly. Because the reasoning, if you can call it that, is distributed across these millions or billions of learned weights in a very complex nonlinear way, It's incredibly difficult to trace back how a specific decision was made. Why did the CNN classify this image as a cat and not a dog? Why did the LLM generate this specific sentence?
Which is a problem for trust, for debugging, for fairness.
All of the above. We try to mitigate this using explainable AI, XAI techniques. Things like shape or lime.
Can you briefly explain what those do, as shape and lime?
Sure. There are methods that try to approximate the complex model's behavior locally, or attribute the output prediction back to the input features. Essentially, they try to highlight which parts of the input, which pixels in the image, which words in the sentence were most influential in leading to the model's output. They provide post hoc explanations.
So they help peek inside the black box even if they don't fully open it.
That's a good way to put it. They are essential tools for building trust and understanding, but interpretability remains a major research area.
And the third big hurdle.
What's number 3? Lack of flexibility, or you could call it brittleness. Because DL models are typically trained so extensively on specific data for a specific task, they often become highly specialized.
Meaning
Meaning a model trained brilliantly to distinguish cats from dogs might fail completely, maybe give a nonsensical answer if you suddenly showed a picture of a leopard or a car.
Yeah.
It hasn't learned a general concept of animal or object. It's learned the specific patterns relevant to the cat versus dog task. They don't tend to generalize well to different problem domains without significant retraining or adaptation.
Got it. Highly optimized, but narrow. Okay, let's quickly cover the tools. What's the ecosystem look like for building these things?
The environment is predominantly Python. You leverage standard data science libraries like pandas for data handling, maybe scikit-learn for pre-processing or simpler models, and various plotting tools.
But for the core deep learning itself.
You absolutely need specialized frameworks. The major players are Google's Tensorflow, often used with Keras, which provides a friendlier, high-level API on top of it. Then there's Facebook's, or Meta's, PyTorch, which has gained enormous popularity, especially in research, and others like CFFE.
What's the key takeaway for choosing between, say, Sklearn's MLP and something like TensorFlow or PyTorch?
It comes down to scale and hardware. If you have a relatively small data set and you're just doing basic MLP work, Sklearn is fine. But, and this is critical, Sklearn's implementation cannot use hardware accelerators like GPUs.
And deep learning needs GPUs.
Desperately for large data sets. The massive parallel computations involved in training deep networks are ideally suited for the architecture of graphics processing units, GPUs, especially using NVIDIA's CDA platform. Trying to train a large CNN or transformer on a CPU using only Sklearn would take, well, practically forever.
So serious DL requires frameworks built for GPUs.
Or even more specialized hardware like Google's TPUs, tensor processing units, which are specifically designed for accelerating neural network computations, especially matrix multiplications. These are often accessed via cloud platforms.
Okay. And zooming out, how does a DL project fit into the bigger picture of data science work?
Conceptually, it fits right into standard methodologies. The CRISP-DM process, the cross-industry standard process for data mining, still applies. You go through phases like business understanding, data preparation, modeling, which is where DL fits in, evaluation, and deployment. DL is a powerful tool within that established workflow.
So the process is familiar, even if the modeling technique is advanced. And one last advantage you wanted to highlight, transfer learning.
Yes, transfer learning is hugely important in practice. It leverages the portability of learned features. The idea is you don't always have to train a massive model from scratch, which requires tons of data and computation.
How does it work?
You can take a network, maybe a CNN, that has already been trained on a huge general data set like ImageNet, which is millions of diverse images. This network has already learned powerful feature extractors in its early layers, those edge detectors, shape detectors, texture detectors.
The foundational visual understanding.
Yeah, exactly. You can then take this pre-trained network, perhaps freeze the weights of those early layers, and just retrain the final few layers on your specific, potentially much smaller data set for your specific task.
So you're transferring the learned knowledge from the general task to your specific one.
Precisely. It saves enormous amounts of training time and data requirements. You're standing on the shoulders of giants, essentially leveraging the features learned from massive data sets for your own, possibly niche, problem. It's a cornerstone of practical computer vision and increasingly other DL areas too.
It really is like the ultimate efficiency hack in deep learning today.
Definitely.
So what does this all mean? Let's try to tie it together. Deep learning. It's characterized by that deep, layered architecture, right? Building complexity internally.
Yes, and its remarkable ability to automatically learn relevant features directly from raw data. No more manual feature engineering for the most part.
And then the specialization of the architectures, we saw CNNs mastering spatial data like images, and then the huge leap with transformers and their attention mechanism for handling sequences and context, like in language.
Exactly. And while the architectures get incredibly complex, GoogleNet, ResNet, transformers, GNs, remember that underneath they often share those core learning processes. Calculating loss, using backpropagation, and optimizing weights with algorithms like SGD or ADAM, the fundamentals persist. Hopefully, you now have a clearer mental map of what these common terms actually refer to.
A much clearer map, definitely. Okay, let's end with that provocative thought. You mentioned GNs creating synthetic data.
Right. Think about this. The power of frameworks like JANs isn't just for creating deepfakes or artistic images. It's moving towards generating highly realistic synthetic data that is statistically similar to real-world data.
So you could generate fake patient data for medical research or synthetic financial data.
Potentially, yes. Consider the implications. What happens when you can perfectly generate synthetic training data for scenarios where real data is incredibly scarce, expensive, or protected by strict privacy regulations? How does this ability to essentially fabricate realistic training information change scientific research, data sharing, and our whole approach to data privacy moving forward? It opens up amazing possibilities, but also complex ethical questions, something to really chew on.